And I think, put my glasses right off. I think we're good. I see my mic responding, and yeah.
I don't see anything on the screen. But,
Technical difficulties.
Okay,
There it is.
All right.
It's just delayed.
Yeah, so it'll be probably a good 2-minute delay between what I say here and what pops up there, because it's
okay, interesting.
going out to some random Chinese satellite and coming back and all that kind of good stuff. So, well, guys, welcome to ACGs. They look different this year. The time allotted for ACGs is shorter, so we're going to move along pretty quick, and we'll pretty much save questions for the end. If it's a burning question, don't hesitate to interrupt me. If I've misspoken and have radically confused you, don't hesitate to interrupt me. And for those of you who are viewing online, awesome. You can submit questions. Stephen and Amanda are over here to my right, stage right. And if you have questions, you can submit it to them, and they will ask those questions as we're going. If there's audio problems or something like that, let us know. I probably can't fix it on the fly. I'll have to investigate and try to figure that out next week. But yeah, Stephen and Amanda are serving as our moderators. And then when he's teaching in a couple weeks, I'll swap spots with you, or maybe your wife could take over. Either way, we'll do that. But for the next 7 weeks, we'll be talking about political theology. And I think I've been really clear that we are not talking American politics. We are not going to be talking about Republicans, Democrats, the presidential race. This is a much more macro kind of discussion about political theology. And I'll just share a little bit about why I'm interested in this topic and have been for a really long time. Grew up in a Christian home, Baptist home, on the evangelical, kind of hedging more towards fundamentalist side of things. And I feel like I was trained well in my faith. I learned the Bible exceedingly well as a child, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. And my family had strong political views, and that was great too. I don't know that we did a great job of understanding how our political views engaged with our theology. But we had strong theology and strong political views. When I went off to college, Houghton College, I ended up, in essence, I was running away from the Lord. And I said, how far away from my call to ministry can I get? And so I picked up a bachelor's degree in political science, because politics is about as far as you can get from God, I thought. And thoroughly enjoyed my undergraduate degree in political science. Studied, Rousseau and Locke and Hobbes and Machiavelli and Augustine and Aquinas. Great political thinkers in the Christian sphere. It was a Christian college, so I had that going for me. During this time, I really developed my political thoughts, but still they weren't connected to my theology. When I went off to Trinity and got my MDiv, I developed, I think, much better theology. It wasn't just because my parents told me this. I understood not just where I was, but other sides of the issues related to theology, and I was growing in my theology. But it wasn't until I went to Covenant Seminary and got a THM in biblical theology that I really kind of began to see how my theology and my politics, my political theology, combined. Because I got a bigger story of the Bible and got to see how my theology and my views on politics kind of fit into this broad story of the people of God and what God was doing. So that's kind of where I have been and why I am excited about engaging this topic of political theology. But the burning question for me is, right now, do we have the theological resources to navigate through this mess? And it is a mess, right? Now, when I say navigate through it, I do not mean to give you a voting guide, which you will take into the ballot with issues lined up on one side and candidates lined up another. That's not what I mean. I mean a big, broad, biblical understanding of society, of civil authority and government, and what I should expect of civil government, how I relate to the state and civil government and political institutions, and how other Christians through the centuries have understood that relationship and engaged in this, their relationship with the state. Also, by navigate, I really do not mean win the next election. And I really don't even mean preserve our democracy or save our nation. When I say how do we navigate through this current mess, I mean how do we remain faithful as the church? How do we maintain our Christian witness and remain faithful to the call to be salt and light, remain faithful to our vocation as sojourners, pilgrims, and exiles? How do we remain faithful as Christians in this current state? So that's why I want to do what we're doing and give you a little bit of an indication of where we're going here coming up. When we talk about political theology, there's two parts of that, right? Theology, which I think we have a pretty firm grasp of what that means. It's discourse related to God. And theology has been broken down into all kinds of sub-genres. Christology, theology about God, Christ. Soteriology, about salvation. Eschatology, about end times. Theology proper, about God the Father. And we're going to need all of those kind of sub-genres of theology to engage this topic well. So it's theology and it's political. Now I don't mean politics, I mean political. The word political comes from the Greek word polis, which is city. And so political, again, I mean it in a broader sense than just politics. Political is communal life. Life shared in the city or in these larger communities in a region in which individuals and smaller units, families, other smaller communities interrelate. Now, political communities often have governments, but political communities it's a broader, larger concept about how small communities, me, my family, interrelate with other smaller communities and cooperate together. So we're going to be talking about that broader sense of political communities as it relates to theology. Kind of the best, simplest definition of political theology that I've come across is from Kavanaugh and Scott. Political theology is the analysis and criticism of political arrangements from the perspective of differing interpretations of God's ways in the world. So we're trying to understand political relationships, these communal relationships, in light of how God interacts with his world. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, much bigger ideas that we'll be kicking around than how to vote in the next election. We won't touch that. That is the third rail, right? We're not going to touch it. Okay. This idea of political theology is not originally a Christian concept. Matter of fact, the first person to coin this that I know of was a pagan philosopher named Varro. Varro famously divided pagan theology into three categories. There was the fabulous theology of fables. That was the realm of the poets and the theater, and they wrote these epic poems about the gods. Varro, the philosopher, was not a fan of that kind of fabulous or mythical theology. There was also natural theology, which was the realm of the philosophers. He really liked natural theology because he was a philosopher, and he was really upset that the common person didn't because they found it boring. They were much more attracted to the sensational theology of the theater and the poets. Then the third category was civil or political theology. And that's what the magistrates of a town, of a city, encouraged. They built temples. They supported civil theology. The priests kind of gave the people ideas of who you ought to sacrifice to for what. If we want peace in the city, we sacrifice to this God. If we want victory in this war, we sacrifice to this God. Here's what we do and how we do it. He understood, Varro did, this philosopher, that was necessary. But he said civil theology is actually filled with a lot of lies. But they're useful lies because they keep the people kind of in line. Augustine engages with Varro significantly in his kind of magnum opus, The City of God. Massive tome, 1,200 pages. And he critiques all of that pretty in depth for like 400 pages. You know, he's engaging the different levels and different kinds of pagan theology. But he also offers a uniquely Christian political theology in the City of God, often referred to as the two cities of Augustine. There's the city of God and the city of man. They have different origins, different ways of relating to the people in the city, and different goals. Now, the city of the two cities of Augustine often gets confused with a concept that emerges much later, the two kingdoms of, for example, Luther. Luther articulated a doctrine of two kingdoms. We are all currently citizens, if we're Christians, of the city of heaven, the heavenly city, and also, at the same time, citizens of an earthly city. And we have to navigate both. Augustine's concept was different. They're not mutually exclusive, but it was different. He said you were either a citizen of the city of God or a citizen of the city of man, is what he called it. And again, different origins, different destinies. We're going to spend a lot more time with Augustine, so I'm just breezing by him right now. As a discipline, this idea of political theology kind of went dormant for centuries and reemerged in the 20th century as a unique discipline under men like Abraham Kuyper, Herman Dooyeweerd, both Dutch theologians, American theologians like Yoder and Oliver O'Donovan. Actually, he's not American, he's British. Others like Rush Dooney and Greg Bahnsen engage with this idea of political theology. We'll talk about them. And then beyond the kind of thinkers, there was a lot of practitioners. We won't talk too much about the practitioners, but more engaging with the political theologians. And I should say, during these intervening years, when I say it reemerged, it never really disappeared. It just wasn't a unique, standalone discipline as it emerged in the 20th century. Political theology showed up under different headings, like ethics or moral theology. And I would say every Christian, since the beginning, has had some kind of de facto political theology, an understanding of how, in light of what God has done, I interact with civil authorities and the community around me. Okay? I'll pause there and say, any questions so far? I haven't given you much to question yet, so good. Okay, so for the rest of our time this morning, I'm going to lay out, I think, 4 commitments that we need to maintain biblically as we go through and evaluate different political theologies and different political theologians through the past few centuries. And I will upfront 100% admit my reliance on a theologian whose name is now, there it is, David Van Drunen, Westminster Seminary. His book that is fairly recent, Political Theologies, Post-Christendom, or something like that. But he lays out these 4 commitments that he thinks Christians ought to maintain and evaluate their political theologies based on. Okay, and we'll see how they're grounded in Scripture here. And feel free to push back. I'm okay with that. I'll tell you you're wrong, but that's okay. Commitment number 1, civil governments are legitimate, or civil government is legitimate. Okay? I'll say more about each of these in a minute. Just lay them out there first. Second, to balance that, civil government is provisional. It's temporary, it's not ultimate. At best, it's penultimate. Third, civil government is common. And I'll explain more what that means. It's not holy, in other words. It's common. And then fourth, civil government is accountable to God. On what basis? Well, give me a few minutes and we'll explore that. Okay, so first, civil government is legitimate. If you were going to make that case, where would you first turn?
Ten Commandments?
What was that?
10 Commandments?
10 Commandments? Okay, maybe.
Romans 13.
Romans 13, that certainly is one of the chief passages we will engage. Not just today, but I think repeatedly throughout the next 7 weeks. Okay? Yeah. So, for example, Romans 13. Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is a servant of God, an avenger, who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So Paul is saying, civil government is established by God. It's instituted by God. He's appointed them. They are God's servants for carrying out justice and bearing the sword. 1 Peter 2 says something very similar. Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Okay? So definitely some good New Testament passages to ground our statement that civil government is legitimate in. But you can go back, I think, to the Old Testament also. Abraham has interactions with King Abimelech of Gerar. Isaac also enters into kind of covenants / treaties with these pagan kings, governors. Kings is better. King Abimelech. David and Solomon have friendly relationships with foreign powers, kind of affirming that they are legitimate. Now, there is illegitimate ways of being in covenant with these pagan powers. At times, Israel enters into covenants with Egypt that they've been told don't rely on Egypt for your salvation. But that doesn't negate Egypt's legitimacy as a nation. Okay? You also have participation in pagan governments by people like Joseph, right? In Egypt. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Nehemiah, Mordecai, Esther, Queen Esther. So participation by God's covenant people in civil government, kind of emphasizing that it is legitimate. And then we've already looked at several different New Testament passages. We didn't talk about Matthew 22, Jesus saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to the Lord what is the Lord's. One of the things that doesn't belong to Caesar is deciding what belongs to Caesar. That's determined by God, and we'll talk about that. But he does have a legitimate role to play in God's providence over his creation. Okay? Paul makes use of his kind of citizenship in the book of Acts. And then we looked at these passages. We could have also looked at 1 Timothy 2. Okay, so civil government is legitimate. It's established by God for a purpose. To balance that, though, I got ahead of myself. So, big question we're not going to answer today. What is the source of its legitimacy? From whence does it derive? What passage could you point to? If I was going to talk about the legitimacy of marriage, we'd go to Genesis 1 and 2, right? God establishing husband and wife, Adam and Eve. Where do I go? I'm not going to answer it now. I'll just give you a hint. Think rainbows. All right. We'll drop that. We'll come back to it. Not today. All right. So civil government is legitimate. I would also emphasize, to balance that, civil government is provisional. You can look at perfect illustration of this is Daniel chapter 2. Daniel is interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And Nebuchadnezzar has this grand dream of a statue that ends up being smashed. I won't read all of Daniel chapter 2 because it's long. But towards the end, as he's interpreting the dream, he says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power and the might and the glory," and he goes on and on, "you are the head of gold in this statue. And there's another kingdom that's coming after you that's silver, inferior to you, but still top notch. After that, it's bronze, more common, kind of bland. After that, it's iron, and then you get clay. And it gets smashed, this whole statue." And Daniel says, "And in those days, the kings of God of heaven will set up a people that shall never be destroyed. Now, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever." So all these kingdoms, this history of Babylon and Assyria and Babylon, and then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, they're going to fade away, as will every other kingdom that man has established. Or that even God has established, but established provisionally. They pass away. Only the kingdom of God endures forever. You can see this also in Hebrews chapter 11. Great. This is one of my favorite chapters of the Bible, right? This hall of faith. And it's talking about Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham left his homeland to go to a land that God had promised. But he died in vain. And he didn't die in vain. I'm pulling in Paul and misquoting Paul even. He died in faith. He died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles, not just in the land they were sojourning, but on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. And if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, the author of Hebrews says, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. So even the land that Abraham was promised was a temporary blessing. He's looking for the heavenly land. Hebrews 13, the author says, "For we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come." All the cities of this world, all the kingdoms and nations of this world are provisional at best, legitimate but temporary. We look forward to the kingdom that does not fade. And then the book of Revelation, I won't unpack that. I'll leave that to Bob. He's doing the series on Revelation. All the kingdoms come to an end, except God's kingdom. So they're provisional. That makes sense? While describing as providing a good, the New Testament nowhere describes civil governments as providing eternal things. Forgiveness of sins, salvation, fellowship with God. None of those things are provided by the state. They simply provide temporary, temporal, provisional goods. So these two things, I think, really have to be held in balance. And we can slide one way or the other. If we slide too much towards emphasizing they're legitimate, then they become almost ultimate. And if we slide too much towards their provisional, we can be dismissive of their God-given authority. So they have to be held in balance, in tension. Good? Okay. The third point, which probably is the most difficult to wrap our minds around, is civil government is common. It's not holy, nor was it intended by God to be holy. Okay? think back to Romans chapter 13, where we started. And it emphasizes that there's a common constituency to the civil governments. They're not just for Christians. They're not just for God's covenant people. Civil governments are meant to be a blessing when they're operating well to everybody. So Paul emphasizes every person is subject to the governing authorities. And there is no governing authority except that which is instituted by God. And he uses these very generic terms for good and evil. Not holy and righteous kind of terms, but good and evil. And they're to distribute justice to every member under their jurisdiction, kind of with no regard for religious or ethnic standing. So that's Romans 13, which we've looked at. It emphasizes, I think, a common constituency. Romans 13, in a way, sticks out like a sore thumb in the book of Romans, because Romans is so Christological, it's so focused on Christ and salvation. And then Romans 13, there's, especially this section about civil governments, there's no mention of salvation or righteousness or Christ. It's bigger, broader picture of God and how he's kind of providing for his entire creation. Also, common standards. This one is the one I think that's hardest for us. What I mean by that is that there is a common kind of baseline standard that all people hold in common of good and evil. For example, you can look at Genesis chapter 20. This is again Abraham interacting with King Abimelech, a pagan king. And Abraham has lied to Abimelech and said, "Oh, Sarah, she's my sister." And Abimelech is warned in a dream by God, she's not. Well, she is, but she's more than that. And Abimelech comes to Abraham and says, "Why have you sinned against me?" He understands, though he's not a part of God's covenant community, that there's something wrong with taking another man's wife. You can fast forward to Genesis chapter 34, and that's the most gruesome, awful chapter of the Pentateuch, and it's the story of the raping of Dinah. And even the father of the men who had done this horrible act says such things should not be done. You know, this isn't right. So there's a common standard, and we'll talk more about that. I would opt for using the phrase natural law. There's something inherent in how God has constructed us as his image bearers. Our conscience testifies to this natural law, and we can observe it by observing our world. We have to say a lot more about that as we go forward. Okay? And we can work towards a common good in the civil government. Jeremiah 29 is maybe where I get my marching orders when I think about how to interact with my nation and the world around me. The people of Israel are in exile, and some are saying, "Oh, we're not going to be here long, don't put down roots." And Jeremiah says, "Nope, this is going to be a while. Plant vineyards, have children, have your children, give them in marriage to others, let them have children, prosper, and seek the good of the city." There is a sense that there's a common good. Yeah, they're pagans. They don't worship Yahweh, but you can together work together. That was really redundant. Together, work together for a common good. You should see Joseph also doing that in Pharaoh's court, Daniel and others as well. All right. So there's civil government is common. Does that make sense? All right. Last one. Civil government is also accountable. And these need to be held in also tension. When I say that civil government is common, I don't mean it's neutral. It is still held accountable to God. Magistrates, governors, presidents, kings, they're not their own bosses. In democracies, us people, we all are not our own bosses. We are still accountable to God. For what? Again, I would appeal to natural law, which we're going to have to. Now, at an individual level, as Christians, we're accountable for much, much more than that. But as a nation, we're held accountable for what is articulated in common law. Paul does not delegate to magistrates the authority to define what is good and evil, but to recognize what God has declared is good and evil and rightly administer justice accordingly. Okay. So again, Old Testament examples are legion, right? You could talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, pagan nation, but yet judged by God. Nineveh, judged by God. Babylon. The minor prophets are full of these oracles against the nations and that God is going to judge you. So there is very clear that even pagan nations are held accountable. The question is, accountable for what? I don't see in the Old Testament that they are held accountable for right worship of Yahweh. They're not. Their idolatry is pointed out, and it's sometimes mocked as folly. You know, why are you worshiping this God that you made of wood and stone? It doesn't make sense. But I don't see anywhere where the kings and the leaders of nations are held accountable for not stamping out false religion. They are held accountable often for oppressing God's people and for grave injustices, for abhorrent wickedness, violence, especially against the other. So they are accountable. And you see that also in the New Testament, for example, the book of Revelation, where nations are called to account. But you even see it, King Herod, which one was it, was judged by God and, eaten by worms. So the kind of temporal nature and that even kings are accountable is emphasized in the New Testament. Okay. So those are our four, I think, commitments that we need to maintain as we start evaluating different political theologies. Because some will do a really good job of emphasizing one but neglect the fourth. Something like that. But I think all of these are biblical and serve kind of as the boundaries for how we engage political theologies. If you want another example of this, think of marriage. Okay? Marriage is obviously legitimate, right? But it's provisional. We won't be married in heaven. And somewhere David and Carol McKay are looking at each other and saying, "Thank you." So it's provisional but legitimate. It's common. It's not just for us Christian folk. Other people can be engaged in marriage, and they're held accountable, I think, for how they engage in their marriage, for loving one another well. So those are our guidelines. Here's where we're going for the next 6 weeks. Next week, August 30th, we'll be talking about the early church, Constantine and Augustine and his two cities more in depth. Then Stephen's up to talk about the medieval church and the papacy, and we'll talk, I think, about two swords, two powers, and how the church through the Middle Ages understood its role in the state. We'll also look on the 13th, my anniversary, at the Anabaptist and pacifist tradition. We'll dive into talking about the transformationalist approach, which is most evangelicals. I have a coffee mug from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School that says transforming the world through Christ. That's a transformational kind of approach. We're to transform the world around us. And if you take that to an extreme, you end up in the theonomist camp, which is we re-implement all of God's laws that were designed for Israel. That's what government, that's what the state should look like. We reinstitute that now. The 27th, we'll talk about the Reformed Two Kingdoms paradigm. Calvin, Luther, especially Calvin, I like Calvin better. And I'll show you my cards right now. That, I think, is the best at balancing all four, to the surprise of no one. October 4th, we'll try to wrap up. We might have a little bit more Reformed Two Kingdom stuff to talk about, and we'll make some conclusions. So that's my approach. That's where we're going. I know I am not covering everything that we would cover were this a college class and a semester long. We can't, right? But what do you see that, man, why are you not talking about this? And if you say President Trump or Joe Biden, I will stone you. So, okay.
Yeah.
Any questions? Go ahead, Mike.
I notice you will finish before the election, though.
That's right, yeah. Gives me enough time to get out of Dodge. So,
Are you a legitimate authority who can stone and institute?
yeah. I appoint my, no.
For this class.
Okay, any other questions? Man, we came in at under time, which never happens in one of my classes. So,
Bravo.
good.
I do have a legit question, but it's kind of, so you talk about natural law. Are you going to do that, or are you expecting me to do that?
No, I'll I thought you would. No. I will talk about it. Do you need me to talk about it before you come up on the 6th?
I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
it's a part of it's a part of all of them,
Oh,
so it's
right.
kind of, you know.
So I will talk about that more next week then, to set the stage. Because I was planning on doing a good bit of it here, but I'll introduce more next week. Good question, thank you. All right, well guys, enjoy. The worship service is great, and I think I can allow you to go into the sanctuary now. We're a little bit early, but I think we're good. And see you next week. If you have questions or concerns, feel free to email me later in the week. Bye.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. And I'll try to make it a little bit more interactive next week.
In terms of comments, Nate Embrecht has been